A few months ago, I made a mod where Princess Peach floats forever, and today we push the limits of Super Mario 3D World by trying to beat levels without touching the floor, and we also explore some fun out-of-bounds secrets in this game. The rules are simple. You have to jump and float once you start the level, and you want to get to the goal pole without touching the floor. Wall jumps are allowed because walls are not the floor, and if you go into a warp box or a pipe, you do technically touch the floor, and if there's something interesting that happens after that, I'll show it. Otherwise, we'll go to the next level. If there's anything interesting I can show you guys by hacking the camera or removing death areas, then you'll also get to see some cool out-of-bounds secrets that you can't normally see. In Super Bell Hill, we do a spin jump with our Princess Peach at the start of the level, and we start our infinite floating. And we can float on over around the first part of Super Bell Hill. You might be wondering what happens if you keep floating away from the level, and different things happen depending on the level. In Super Bell Hill, if you start floating away from the level, eventually the sky turns completely black and you can just see the sun. And I took a snapshot at the perfect moment here because Princess Peach is tired from floating for so long. Let's give her a moment to rest and take a nap. Yes, this is how Princess Peach sleeps. You might be wondering if you can get to the rocket ship in the background here, and perhaps surprisingly, it has no collision, so you just go right through it, and if you want to try to drop down here, you fall low enough so that the death area kills Peach. These green steps in the background of Super Bell Hill also have no collision. In this game, a lot of background objects that you can't reach are just decorations, so you fall right through them, but some objects do surprisingly have collision. So from your first jump in the level, you are able to float through Super Bell Hill, and you are actually high enough to make it all the way to the goal pole. But you'll only get 8,000 points, not the 10,000 points that you get from reaching the top of the goal pole. But there's something that you can do to reach the top of the goal pole. You'll notice that if you float over here, you're just slightly above these steps at the end of the level. You're just slightly above the ground here, so you can't float straight into this wall to do a wall jump, so you have to carefully position yourself, fall into the wall jump, and you can just barely do a dive into the top of the goal pole. Koopa Troopa Cave has a seriously cool out-of-bounds trick. Normally, what you want to do is you go into this pipe and then you continue through the cave, but you can't get very far without touching the ground doing this. But there's something very funny and unexpected if you go around this wall at the start of the level here. There's normally a death area back here that kills you and stops you from going this way, but I removed the death area so you can go here now and you can see what happens. And I know from editing this game that the final area of the level is actually back here. So if you edit the level and you remove the death areas, then you can actually float over to the very end of the level and reach the top of the flag, which is really cool, even though you can't normally do this. If you actually enter this pipe at the start of the level and go into the cave like you're supposed to, there's an invisible wall that prevents you from coming out of this cave. So I removed these invisible walls so that you can see what happens if you float away from the level. If you start floating away from the cave right here, the level starts to get blurry, objects start disappearing once you're far enough, and then as you float far enough away, everything disappears. If you go back, you can see the objects again, and this is based on how far away you are. So let's float along the perimeter of the cave, and there's normally an invisible ceiling that stops you from getting this high here, but from this camera angle, you can actually see that the cloud platforms are rotating around like this and going behind the wall. In the comments of one of my past videos, a lot of people were guessing that this is how the cloud platforms work, and if you thought this is how the cloud platforms work, you are right, this is how they work. There's another funny and very unexpected thing about these clouds here. What happens if you continue straight out of the level from these clouds here? If you just keep floating away to the right? Well, the level gets blurry and starts to disappear when you get far enough, just like before, but suddenly, the music changes to this happy, cheery music that normally plays when you're outside, and you have a red background for a moment that turns into a black background in a moment, and it becomes the regular outside background. Then you slide into a wall and you're wondering, what is this? And you realize it's the wall from the beginning of the level. So now you know that the cave in Koopa Troopa Cave is actually to the left of this starting area. And if you float back to the left from here, then you can get back to the Koopa Troopa Cave like this. The Chargin blockade is unsurprisingly easy. You just jump and start floating at the start, then you can bounce on the Chargin chucks, and you can keep floating after you bounce on them, which is nice, then you can collect the green star, all without touching the floor. At Mount Beanpole, you can't get very far without dying, and a bigger problem is that you have to go very high vertically to progress through the level. But something very surprising about the level is that once you're up here by the piranha plant, you actually can float on over to the final island. in a lot of parts of this game and in a lot of levels of this game, the developers added death areas to prevent players from going between areas, like we saw in Koopa Troopa Cave, where you don't want to skip past the beginning part to the end part of the level. But there's nothing like that in this part of the level here, and you can just float on over to the final island. In Plessie's Plunging Falls, you normally have to ride Plessie, so there isn't a lot of floating as Princess Peach, so I decided to remove these gates at the start and float on by without Plessie. And when you're floating through Plessie's Plunging Falls from up high, you get a very nice scenic view looking down at the level from way up here. There are all kinds of cool things that you can see. There are arches that you can just float right through because they have no collision, and you can see parts of object models that are just cut off suddenly because you can't normally get this high and see them. And this is something that we've seen in my past videos where I removed gravity from the game and we were exploring all kinds of areas. But one thing that you might notice while you're floating across with Peach like this is how slow Princess Peach is and how fast Plessie is in comparison. So even if you float along the entire time, not wasting any time, just going straight, you're not fast enough to make it to the goal pole. I wanted to see if there was anything that we could do to make it to the goal pole, so I sped up Peach, and man, we are flying through the level, kind of almost literally flying. This is how the game was meant to be played. Well, I guess you weren't really meant to be able to fly infinitely while moving at a faster speed, but it feels very nice to be floating through the level so quickly. Once you make it past this final drop here that's normally in the level where you ride Plessie, the end of the level is somewhere up and to the right from here, and you can get to it, but the hardest part is actually finding where exactly the level is and dropping down to it, because you can't see it from up high and you have to drop down to the level. But once you get lucky and find out where the final area is, you can drop down to the top of the goal pole from there. At Switch Scramble Circus, I was honestly very surprised at how far you could go into the level from a single jump. With a single jump, you could clear the entire first room, and you're high enough to continue into the next room. At first, I thought the way that we'd have to make it to the second room would be floating out of the exit of this first room over here and going around to the next room, but you could actually make it over the floor here and continue to the next room easily like this. The second room was causing some problems for me at first because I could reach some of the lower panels, but I couldn't reach the higher panels. I couldn't see them with my camera angles. I actually tried floating around this island and trying to sneak into the room from the back to see if I could reach any of the switch panels that way, and I can reach some of the top panels, but I couldn't reach the very final top panel and activate it. And one interesting thing to point out here is that even though it looks like this place has no ground back here, or it looks like it's invisible ground, you can actually walk down here with Peach, and you can exit out of these walls back to the normal level. These walls, like a lot of objects in games, are solid from only one side, so that's why we can leave through this wall but not enter through. And this is something that we saw in my Mario Odyssey modding video where we put many Goombas in jail. After getting all these panels, we float on over to the side and we reach the next area with the checkpoint flag, but we are of course not going to grab the checkpoint flag because it is on the ground. I was worried that the ground was too high here and I wouldn't be able to make it up these stairs, so I tried going around to activate all these switch panels. I tried touching some of these switch panels while we were floating along, and from some of these angles you can't reach some of them. It's really interesting that if you go around this part of the room and you look back into it, you can see through these walls, but you can't actually touch the panels because the walls prevent you from reaching the panel, even if your cursor is over it. If you keep floating forward through the level, you'll notice that the rest of the level isn't here yet, and that's because in the level Switch Scramble Circus, the switch panels actually load in the later parts of the level when you activate all the switch panels. When I was floating back along the right side of this island, I noticed that I could touch some of the panels from here, and that's because the wall wasn't blocking me from this angle, so we might have a shot at getting all the switch panels anyways. I floated back along to the left side, and while still floating, I touched a bunch of switch panels, and there's only one left now, so I floated along to the right slowly, and when it was possible, I got the final switch panel. This part of the level isn't blank anymore, it is now loaded in because we got all of the switch panels. The one problem we have now is that this is starting to become a bit like Mount Beanpole. You have to go up vertically to make it past this part of the level, but you unfortunately can't keep gaining height while you are floating. We'll have to touch the ground and jump to keep going up. If you try to float around this area, you quickly run into a death area, and even if you didn't run into the death area, the next part of the level isn't going to be loaded in until you get all the switch panels in the area with the magikoopa. But, big but, if you sneak past here, you might notice something interesting. The clear pipe cannon actually is still back here behind the wall. It's not an object that gets loaded in when you hit all the switch panels. It's already here. It's just that the floor of the level up ahead isn't loaded in yet, but the clear pipe cannon is here. The switch panels and the goal pole in the distance are also there too. So what happens if you go into this clear pipe cannon and you launch yourself? This is what happens. Yeah, you just keep falling and there's no death area or anything and the music just keeps playing. But since the goal pole is actually there all along, I was wondering if we could float over to the goal pole and skip the entire level. When I looked at the level in Spotlight, there is a lot of death areas in this level all over the place, and I felt like a burglar in a museum trying to steal a diamond without getting caught by the lasers, where the lasers were death areas in this game that instantly kill you if you walk into them. But you actually can maneuver your way all the way over to where the goal pole is. Almost. The only problem is that the goal pole is way too high from where you start in the level. If you were able to get high enough to the magikoopa near the end of this level, you could skip over this section and float on over to the goal pole, but you can't do this from the beginning of the level, unfortunately. I also noticed this section over here. There's a certain spot when you're floating right around here that once you get close enough to this final area, clouds start to spawn here. And once you step back far enough, the clouds suddenly disappear. So you can keep going back and forth like this, getting clouds to spawn and getting the clouds to immediately disappear. I wanted to put Princess Peach in a Captain Toad level, and for some reason when I started up the level, she just flew up out of the pipe like this, and she wouldn't come back down. Goodbye, Princess Peach! Captain Toad levels are not for you! Princess Peach took the don't touch the floor challenge a bit too seriously here. She is heading very far away from the floor right now. But once you're in the Captain Toad level, you can get it to work properly, and if you're interested in more about Captain Toad levels, I have a video where I made a custom Bowser's Fury level based on the Captain Toad levels that you might enjoy. Bowser's Highway Showdown is a level with a lot going on, and the developers put a lot of death areas in this level, and that really makes sure that you can't skip past one part of the level to the next. If you try to float away in almost any direction, you're met with a death area very quickly. Even if you beat the Bowser boss and you try to float to the castle in the background, Peach dies very quickly. In a past video, we've seen that you can get Bowser to turn around completely backwards, and it's hilarious to see Bowser's torso twisted like this and him blasting fire in the wrong way. It's also funny that if you manage to get behind Bowser, he doesn't really notice that you're behind him, he still thinks that you're in front of him, and he keeps throwing exploding soccer balls back at where you're normally supposed to be. But if we remove enough death areas from the level, you can do a few skips, and you can make it over to the final castle's flag, but this is overall a really solid level that makes the no touching the floor challenge very difficult. If you're interested in how these Bowsers that run away from you work and a more in-depth look at the design of this specific level, I made a video looking at exactly that because there's so much happening in this level design. If you like seeing what is possible in games, fun challenges, and more gameplay like this, you can subscribe because you'll be notified when new videos come out. I'm wishing all of you an amazing day ahead of you. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it, and take care, everybody.